Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about CBT and REBT. We did go over uh, the exam, um, and that took a little while, but CBT and REBT are really brief therapy. The theories are fairly short, um, and yet. CBT is the most research theory out there. Um, so let me say this. Uh, I love CBT or Adler, whichever you want to call it. Uh, but yeah, and REBT. So you know, you got Beck, you got Ellis, but the original concept came from Adler. Nobody actually says that. Um, but, so I love that. Adler saw it as a technique. Okay. So you personally, that's just me personally. Um, I usually use a foundational theory and I incorporate CBT and REBT whenever it's needed. I mean, people don't always talk about irrational thoughts, you know? So, you know, or catastrophize or whatever. So I think it's interesting that, um, you know, I think it's interesting that people like to use CBT or REBT alone. And it's a very simple theory to use. It's very understandable. Um, People who tend to like control love CBT and REBT because they know exactly what to do. It makes sense. It's very logical, very rational. Uh, but so I might use a foundational theory to begin to build trust. I always use person-centered. And but I tell the client, my overarching theory is existential, and I tell them why. It's because I believe we're all on a search for meaning in our lives. And then I usually incorporate person-centered in the beginning, and uh, I look for um, places in their lives where they might not feel fulfilled. And that's really kind of like Glasser's basic needs, or even the basic ID a little bit. And we find out, well, where aren't they feeling fulfilled? Uh, and what needs aren't being met? And uh, and then we address kind of, do they have irrational thoughts? Or distorted cognitions surrounding those choices that they're making. And that's where I bring in kind of CBT, REBT. I personally like REBT because the technique is very easy for clients to understand because they can just follow A, B, C, D, E, F, you know, and we'll go over that. And then um, we deal with some irrational thoughts, some poor choices that weren't working for them. So we're kind of combining reality choice and CBT, REBT. And a lot of counselors stop there. But there's more to life than that. And there's deeper things to consider. And that's where I kind of go more existential and continue therapy on beyond brief therapy. The problem, and this is all my personal opinion, uh, the problem I see with CBT and REBT, and there's lots of benefits. They deal with irrational thoughts and all of that, better choices. But the problem is, um, many times we make irrational thoughts because of a deeper issue. And CBT deals with the irrational thought, but it does not deal with the deeper issue that results in an irrational thought. And that's the problem. So if you don't deal with a deeper issue, the symptomology reoccurs. Sometimes in the same way, sometimes in a different way, but it definitely reoccurs. And so I think personally, we have to deal with those deeper issues at hand. So CBT is really the most researched theory in the world because it's brief. You can get the study done in no time. Clients understand it. Clients acknowledge that, hey, I did have an irrational thought, and now I know how to catch it. I know how to substitute a positive thought, debate it, substitute a positive thought, and I have a different reaction. It's very simple. And when they're able to do that, they feel successful. And when somebody feels successful, they're like, hey, the theory worked. So all of the pre and post surveys have fantastic reactions. Yeah, it worked. I understand my irrational thought process and I can substitute a positive thought and they leave. The problem is the symptom reoccurs 2 months later if the underlying issue is not dealt with, but you don't see that in the assessment for uh, the articles for the research. They don't follow up 2 or 3 months later. Um, but if there is a deeper issue, it's not over. And then you get like, oh, therapy was a good experience, dealt with my irrational thoughts, but it didn't work. And you get that 6 months to a year later. So, that's just my personal response to this. Everybody loves CBT. It makes sense. It's straightforward. Students can do this in practicum. That's how deep it is. All right. I gave up sarcasm years ago. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the two theories themselves. So Albert Ellis, 1913 to 2007, and Aaron Beck, I think he's still alive. I don't know if yeah, I haven't heard about his death, but, so 1921, he'd be pretty old now. Um, so the interesting thing is these theories are so similar. They just use different language for the same concepts. And, and I think they both drew from Adler's original concept. But here's the interesting thing. I don't think out of everything I've read, and maybe you'll find something different, I never heard about Beck or Ellis arguing about who was first to come up with the ideas or anything like that. I never heard anything like that. And you know, so I did do a little research. I think Ellis came up with publications first, but uh, Beck kind of went beyond Ellis. So CBT became the standard, although I do like Ellis better. Um, and they both went about it in two different ways. And I think this has a lot to do with each of their personalities. Like, I think Ellis desired to be liked. And he wrote all of these self-help books. Like they used to call them like dime store paperbacks. And you know, they were inexpensive. He wrote them on everything from like dating to group therapy to all kinds of different subjects, whatever you needed to correct in your life. And he would get a client and find out what their problem was, and he'd pull off one of these paperbacks and hand it to them, and they'd read that, and then they'd move on with therapy. But he really was very popular in the self-help community. Um, Now, Beck was really into academics and studies. And so, you know, um, because of all the publications, I think his eventually outlasted Ellis's. Uh, because and Beck also kind of firmed it up with he came up with like the Beck's depression inventory, the Beck's anxiety inventory, and those became hugely popular for assessing depression and anxiety. And they're very simple and quick to use. And you know, I know that the first assessments weren't considered that accurate, but the second and further revisions were considered more valid and reliable. Um, let's see. So if you use them for some reason, don't use the original one, use the most recent ones. Um, so let's talk about Ellis first. Um, the So Ellis was born in Pittsburgh, moved to New York at age of 4, very young. His health was never good. Constant theme, health was never good. He was hospitalized 9 times as a child for kidney disease, then renal issues at 19 and diabetes very young at 40. So he was always dealing with health issues. And, that's kind of one of the themes, either dealing with mortality or the loss of a loved one or one's own health issues. Um, and then at 19, he was really shy and he wanted to overcome that. And, he wanted a date, basically. He was 19, normal person, kind of wanted to, get to know somebody. And, so he forced himself to go to the Bronx Botanical Garden, that's like going to Phipps in Pittsburgh, and talk with 100 women. And here's the funny part. In 1 month, here's the funny part. He never got a date, but he no longer feared rejection. So there's that. Poor guy. Um, So he studied psychoanalysis, moved away from that to create REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy. He says it combines a lot of stuff, humanistic, uh, which is Rogers, phenomenological, behavioral, cognitions, emotions, behaviors, interact just as with multimodal. Um, he should mention Adler more. Okay, Jessica, here you go. The Greek philosopher Epictetus said, people are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them. And this is kind of like the line that Ellis lives by, you know. So let's think about that. Two women are in a taxi in New York City, in the back of the taxi, and they're going to lunch together. And uh, they go through an intersection, and a truck hits them and demolishes the taxi. Fortunately, everybody's okay. They walk over and sit on the sidewalk, walk curb, and one of the women says, "Oh, what a horrible thing. This has ruined our day. I'm going home." And the other one says, "It's a miracle. Nobody was hurt in that accident. Let's go celebrate and have a great lunch." They both experienced the same event, but they interpreted that single event in two completely different ways. So, you know, uh, I think that um, the way he uses his theory is to educate his clients in the theory itself. And that's why he was always handing out his self-help books. He wanted to educate the clients in the theory, and then he would apply it to their lives in therapy. But they would understand what he was talking about. He didn't have to explain everything because they read his book. You'll even see when you watch the Gloria tape that she's like, "Oh, I read your book on such and such," and so it was very popular at that time. So I like this theory because I do teach his technique to clients if they have an irrational belief, because it's very easy to understand. So A, B, C, D, E, F. All right. So ABC identifies the irrational thought. DEF disputes it and comes up with a more positive thought. So let's kind of go through this process, because when you take your next exam, your technique for REBT is the ABCDEF method. That's your technique in the primary counseling session, part 2. All right, so A, the activating event. Well, let's use the example of the taxi cab and the 2 women going to lunch. So the activating event was the taxi getting in a wreck. B, the belief about the event. One woman believed it was a miracle, let's go celebrate. The other woman believed worst thing that ever happened to her, going home, missing lunch. C is the consequence. There's an emotional consequence which results in a behavioral action. So the one woman was probably really happy because she had just experienced a miracle and everything was great. The other woman was probably very sad because, her day was ruined. And the behavior was one went out to lunch and celebrated, the other one went home and did nothing. So, ABC. So, the second part is, what do we do about it? How do we deal with negative or irrational beliefs? So, D, dispute the irrational belief. And so we might talk with the woman who had the negative take on the situation and talk about reframing her reaction and interpretation of the event. And so we talk about it. And he goes into a lot of other language, like catastrophizing, everything's bad, minimalizing, maximalizing. He developed a whole vocabulary that Beck also used. And so we dispute the irrational or negative belief. And she may come to see that, oh, wow, there are things to be thankful for. There are things to be happy about. Not everything is negative. And so that results in E, a different effect. Okay. And she's no longer being pessimistic. The glass is no longer half empty. She's being more optimistic. Now it's half full. So, she's being motivated in a positive frame of mind. And then F, the final result is a new feeling, which would result in a new behavioral action. Hey, yeah, you're right. Let's go to lunch. It was a good thing. So when I'm talking with people, I add a couple things here. Okay. So we can talk about a situation that occurred to give them a good example to apply these things to. But now I want them to apply them in the future when they're not in a therapeutic session. So now I have to teach them, okay, if this happens again, what do you do? And you have to add a couple things, okay, especially if they're by themselves. So they have to learn to catch themselves when they're experiencing an irrational or negative thought. So, you know, right after the belief, they need to say, wow, I'm really being negative here, or, I'm using negative self-talk, or I'm interpreting an event as extremely negative or irrational. I'm going to stop myself and think about this a little bit before I move on. And people don't realize that emotions are always preceded by a thought. And, we believe something about a person, about an event, about an interaction that results in a feeling. We don't just feel. And so if we can catch ourselves at the belief stage, about the interpretation stage, we can say, okay, well, maybe it's not as bad as I had originally thought. How can I substitute a different framing of this situation, a more positive framework, so that everything's not negative? And they process that. Okay, well, yeah, there are some positive things. Maybe I was catastrophizing, you know, maybe not everything's about me, taking everything personally. Uh, and, you know, that'll result in a different frame of mind and a different feeling. So, one way I learned to do this really young was I was in middle school. It was all the drama in middle school, all the insecurities. And we were having like middle school, most schools have like their first dances. And so I had a good friend and I asked her, I said, hey, would you like to go to the spring fling or whatever it is? And she said, oh, I'm sorry, I can't go with you. And I'm thinking, oh, she doesn't like me. I can't believe this. I'll never find a date or somebody who likes. I was catastrophizing. I was being self-critical, everything. And we usually sat together and lunch. And a couple days later, uh, we were sitting together and lunch, and I was depressed. And um, she she brought it up, and she said, "Yeah, I am still sorry. I can't go with you to the dance. We'll just be out of town. I'll be visiting my grandmother that weekend." And so I realized it had nothing to do with me. They had this family trip planned, and I was so happy about it with her. She's like, "Why are you happy about it?" I'm like, "Oh, I thought you didn't like me." So, um, but what I learned by that is that people jump to conclusions, or they make it something negative about themselves. We have negative self-talk. So you can translate A, B, C, D, E, F from a situation that is outside of ourselves to the negative self-talk we carry in our own minds. Yeah. And I think that's even more helpful than an interpretation of events. So I think a lot of us are a little self-critical, and maybe we're too hard on ourselves. And if we can catch ourselves before that negative criticism runs away with our thoughts, and substitute some positive self-talk instead that is more rational, we'll feel a lot better about ourselves. So I use it more with that internal dialogue than even external activating events. All right. Well, what do you think about Ellis and the ABCDEF method. Yeah, it's pretty easy to use. This is the easiest exam question in the class for that reason. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Aaron Beck, cognitive therapy. He calls it cognitive therapy. It turned into CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So some of the differences between REBT and CBT. REBT is very directive, and it is even somewhat confrontational. Like, it's not confrontational in the same way as uh, Fritz Perls. Like, he was a little insulting, but it's more like a debate with the client. So it's still confrontational. Um, and I think CBT and REBT therapists talk a lot. And I like it when a client talks more. And then I can react. Um, so REBT can be like really directive and they'll debate with the client, whereas CBT, Beck would say it was more Socratic, open-ended questions and, um, you know, things like that. REBT uses the term irrational beliefs. CBT uses the term cognitive distortions. As far as I can tell, it's the same thing. Um, CBT is used for depression and anxiety. And, that's why he came up with both the depression inventory and the anxiety inventory. The book has a lot of terminology listed under cognitive behavioral therapy. So using Socratic dialogue, Beck would go about the same process, but he doesn't use the ABCDEF process. He uses a dialogue to help the client realize each stage of irrational beliefs and interpretation of events and criticism of self. And he would say that a lot of irrational beliefs lead to depression or anxiety. So, um, yeah. So he uses the term cognitive distortions. He uses the term arbitrary inferences. And that is making conclusions without any evidence. Ellis would call this catastrophizing. So everything's a catastrophe, but maybe there's not really evidence that it is. Like I jumped to some conclusions, like, oh, she doesn't like me, but in reality, I had no evidence for that, just happened to be a family trip. Selective abstraction, making conclusions based on only isolated details of an event. Overgeneralization, extreme beliefs based on a single incident applied inappropriately to dissimilar events or situations. So there might be a single incident and, maybe I had a disagreement with somebody, but I overgeneralize and apply it to every part of a relationship, overgeneralizing. Magnification and minimization. All these are very similar. There's just slight differences. Perceiving a situation in greater or lesser light than it deserves. Personalization, relating external events to oneself without basis. Something might happen, but I think like it's almost a little narcissistic. Like everything that happens has to do with me in some way. Uh, labeling and mislabeling, portraying one's identity on imperfection or mistakes rather than the whole person. Everybody knows their own faults or uh, maybe things we're not good at or, something like that. Like, you know, um, I'm somewhere between 5'9" and 5'10". I say I'm 5'10", whatever it is. I don't say I'm 5'9" and a half. Uh, but it would be nice if I was like 6 feet tall. But I could really perseverate on my height, uh, you know, and but I don't think that's the whole me, you know. There's more to me than just that. Polarized thinking, thinking in all or nothing terms or either or extremes. Um, yeah, so those are pretty short theories. I mean, there are books about them, but I summarized enough that you could actually use these when you go into practicum. So if you were, let's say you're going into practicum, you could take the skills class and you can use person-centered therapy with your new clients in practicum. And you can take REBT from this class, and it would be acceptable for you to use that with your clients after you use person-centered. And that would get you pretty far in your practicum experience. And most insurance companies love CBT because it's measurable. Yeah, they could see outcomes. Whereas existentialism, it's hard to measure meaning, you know? So insurance companies don't really like that. All right, questions about either one of those theories? Yeah, 21. It was over 100. Oh, now I gotta put it in my notes.